Okay, so let's dive into the proteins a little bit. This is going to be a surface level understanding, surface level video on what the proteins are and what kind of proteins you should choose. But first I have to describe what macronutrients are. So macronutrients are our three main sources of fuel. Okay, we've got proteins, we've got carbohydrates, and we have fats. One of the benefits of ketosis is the fact that carbohydrates are out of the equation. So we're now only dealing with fats and proteins. It makes it that much easier. You see, from a nutritionist standpoint, what happens is there's always a juggling, a balancing act, if you will, of proteins, fats, and carbs. Sure, there's micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, things like that, but the root of pretty much every diet plan comes down to shifting around the macronutrients based on the individual. So we're always juggling the amount of carbs, the amount of proteins, the amount of fats, varying different levels. When it comes to ketosis and when it comes to low carb, high fat diets, carbohydrates are out of the equation. So now we only have two variables. It makes life easier. But it's super important that you're choosing the right protein sources. And we're going to dive into a little bit more detail later on in the program, but I want to describe at least now what you should be aiming for. So when you go for your proteins, of course you want to go for organic whenever possible. I'm a huge proponent of organic meat sources. If you're going to use meats, they need to be organic simply because it's going to help you metabolize them better. You're not having to deal with pesticides. You're not having to deal with all kinds of genetically altered things that are affecting your leukotriene levels, your actual inflammatory markers. But we also want to make sure that we're eating the right cuts of meat, things that are fattier cuts of meat. And here's why. When you're in a ketogenic state, fattier cuts of meat are actually good for you. So we're talking about eating the chicken thigh instead of just the chicken breast. See, those are fats that you can't get from vegetable sources. You can't get those from coconut oil. You can't get those fats from almonds. We're talking about good, healthy fats from all cuts of meat. But additionally, you don't want to go too crazy on the protein amounts. If you look at the program, you'll notice that it's mostly fats. High calorie components of fat, medium calorie component of protein, and very low calorie component of carbs. Almost like a 4-3-1 ratio. 4 parts fat for 3 parts protein for 1 part carbohydrates. Now I'll make that a little bit more clear in the program itself. But protein sources, we can look at things like eggs, okay? We can look at things even like bacon, which you normally wouldn't think of. You can think of things like prime rib. You can think of New York steaks. You can think of ribeye steaks with all the fat, all the marbling. That saturated fat is good. However, if you combine carbohydrates with that fat, it can become bad. Now, there is a lot of research out there that talks about how certain fats can contribute to higher cholesterol levels and things like that. Again, I'm not a doctor, so I'm not going to comment exactly where that comes in. But the simple fact of the matter is there's a lot of research recently that's showing that there isn't necessarily that direct correlation. And when you're in a ketogenic state, sometimes you can even reduce your cholesterol levels just by being in ketosis. Now, when you consume protein, you're going to want to keep it somewhat to a minimum. The reason that I say this is your body does something very unique. You see, it breaks down proteins into glucose when it's deprived of fats. So in this case, if you're not getting enough fat and you're consuming too much protein, your body is going to start breaking down that protein into glucose. It's always trying to get back to that state. It's always trying to get back to using glucose. So you have to be careful not to consume too much protein or else it will convert into sugar. And guess what? Then it can knock you out of this ketogenic state and you have to work hard to get back in. So that's why I highly suggest using proteins that have high amounts of fat in them already, because it decreases the chance of you overeating the protein. It's actually really hard to eat too much protein coming from a ribeye steak because you're getting enough fat along with it that you're going to be satiated and you're going to be full before you ever end up finishing the steak. Whereas if you were to eat something really lean, like say 99% lean ground turkey, which is good, but don't get me wrong, it's not always where we want it. If you were to eat that, it's a lot easier to overeat it because you don't have the fats to satisfy you. So you end up having to add additional fats to it and things like that. Now, I will make a couple of notes when it comes to protein. Okay, when it comes to bacon, we want to make sure we're getting nitrate and nitrite-free bacon. Don't get ones that are loaded with preservatives. That will make you feel run down. That will be bad. There is a study from 2014 that found that nitrites and nitrates are technically a carcinogenic. So avoid those at all costs. When it comes to eggs, you've probably seen videos that I've done about eggs. We want to make sure we're getting cage-free, pasture-raised, pasture-fed organic eggs, not just cage-free or not just organic. We have to get all of those. Sure, they're a little bit more expensive, but they're worth it, because all that it means if they're cage-free is it means they're not in individual cages. They can still be cooped up in small pens with multiple chickens per pen, where they're having to be fed lots of antibiotics that ultimately end up making them toxic to us. We want to get organic, free range as much as possible. Get them from your neighbor, get them from a local farmer, get them from something like that if you don't want to go to the store for them. Very, very important there. Then when it comes down to other protein sources like protein shakes or anything like that, make sure that you're not getting traditional whey protein. Get a whey protein isolate or go for a pea protein, something that does not have copious amounts of dairy or copious amounts of casein protein. You're going to see that although dairy is allowed in this protocol, I still try to recommend eliminating it as much as possible. Anyhow, that's enough for protein. If you have any questions regarding protein, you can always contact the support email.